Hi, this is Dan, and this is the first in a series of videos I want to do about Hartford's lost department stores. In future videos, I want to talk about the big ones, G. Fox, Sage Allen, Brown Thompson, Wise Smith, and others. But in this video, I'll be talking about some of the stores that did not survive to the mid-20th century to become well known. Sawyer's and C.S. Hills and Company. I'll also talk about the Hartford branches of two five and dime store chains, J.J. Newberry's and S.S. Kresge, the ancestor of Kmart, as well as the Hartford branch of the Springfield, Massachusetts-based Steiger's department stores. All of these stores were located on the short block on the west side of Main Street between Asylum and Pratt Street, an area that is today a parking lot. This picture shows the west side of Main Street north of Asylum Street in Hartford in the mid-1890s. I've talked about the buildings that have stood on the corner of Main and Asylum in another video which I'll link in the description below. The building on the corner shown in this picture is typical of the Federal-style commercial structures erected in Hartford in the early years of the 19th century. It was built in 1821 by Henry L. Ellsworth, who developed a lot of real estate in Hartford at that time. The building came to be known as the Catlin Building after a later owner, Julius Catlin, who had a large dry goods store on the first floor. Dry goods stores which carried textiles, clothing, and other goods were often the ancestors of the later department stores. There were numerous other businesses in the building over the years. Next to the Catlin Building was a good example of the many Italianate-style brownstone commercial buildings erected in Hartford in the mid-19th century. This one was built in 1861 on a site that had just previously been the Connecticut Hotel. It was designed by local architect Octavius Jordan and was called the Hills Block. The ground floor had stores and there were offices above. One of the first businesses to open in the building was another dry goods store, C.S. Weatherby & Company, also known as Weatherby, Nose & Pelton. In 1880, the Weatherby space was taken over by R.P. Kenyon & Company, hatters and furriers. Numerous other retail businesses occupied this building over the years. When this photograph was taken in 1897, the old Catlin block had just been demolished. Only the outline of the building remained on the now exposed south side of the Hills block. A new Catlin building would soon be erected on the site. It would be home to the Sawyer Dry Goods Company, run by George O. Sawyer, which was a true department store. Sawyer's occupied every floor of the six-story building, which featured two elevators and a restaurant on the top floor. An innovation was that each department had its own cashier to facilitate sales. Just a month before Sawyer's opened in December of 1897, another six-story department store had also opened a few blocks north on Main Street. This was Wise Smith & Company. But while Wise Smith would prosper well into the 1950s, Sawyer's went out of business in 1900 after a little over 2 years in business. Its remaining stock was then sold to Wise Smith. Shortly after the new Catlin building, briefly home to Sawyer's, was built in 1897, the neighboring Hills block underwent some alterations as well. 2 additional floors were added. Also, as the Hartford Courant newspaper reported on May 19, 1898, quote, "Extensive alterations are soon to be made on the Hills block on Main Street. Plans for the improvements are now being prepared by I.A. Allen, Jr., the architect. Measurements were taken yesterday for the plans. The stores on the ground floor are to be lowered to the sidewalk. It is expected that this work can be done without interfering with the business of the stores. The proprietor of one of the stores said yesterday that he would like the improvement if the floor could be lowered without the rent being raised. Frank Beecher, who runs the Marble Pillar Saloon under the store of the Bonner Preston Company, has had notice to leave. The lowering of the stores will not leave enough room for a saloon in the basement. 2 additional floors will be built. They will be of brownstone and will correspond with the old building." Unquote. The 1897 Catlin building on the corner was demolished after 14 years in existence and replaced in 1912 by the Hartford National Bank building, which later became the Hartford Aetna Realty building. Designed by Don Barber, at 11 stories it is considered to be Hartford's first skyscraper. It was torn down in 1990. As for the Hills Block, it was demolished in 1929 and a new structure was built in its place, designed by E.J. Hoffman of New York. The building featured a terracotta exterior. It was built for Schultz United, a 5-and-dime store chain described at the time as a junior department store. Unfortunately, the store opened in November of 1929, just after the stock market crash. Schultz United went into receivership in 1931, and as part of a reorganization, the least profitable stores in the chain were shut down. One of these was the Hartford store, which was quickly taken over by another 5-and-dime chain, J.J. Newberry Company. The company started in 1911 with a single store in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. The chain had grown to 380 stores coast to coast by 1931 when the Hartford branch opened. In 1928, a year before the Newberry building was erected for Schultz United, another new commercial building was erected just to the north. It replaced an old 4-story building in the picture on the left. One of the tenants who had to relocate out of the demolished building was the 20-year-old jewelry store of Lux, Bond & Lux, which in 1932 would become Lux, Bond & Green. The new building was constructed for S.S. Kresge, another 5, 10, and 25-cent chain store. The company was started by Sebastian S. Kresge in 1899 with stores in Memphis and Detroit. The chain eventually became Kmart. Located between the Newberry and Kresge stores was the second of 2 Hartford branches that would open in 1929 of the Clear Weave hosiery chain. The other one was located at the corner of Main and Church Streets. This color photograph is a view north up Main Street in 1946. The old State House was to the right. The photo shows the red signs of both the Newberry and Kresge stores at that time. The red signs also appear in the upper right-hand corner of this photograph from 1949. Both storefronts would be altered in the 1950s. J.J. Newberry's would gain a marquee, and it would cover over the second-floor windows to display its name in bold red letters. S.S. Kresge would undergo a similar sign change in 1955. As part of its remodeling, Kresge would also take over the adjacent Clean Weave space as well. So by the mid-1950s, the 2 stores had more prominent signage, as did Bert's Shoe Store, located in the Hartford Aetna building on the left. By the time of the photograph on the left, in 1980, the Newberry sign had lost its JJ and CO. Next door, Kmart had changed the Kresge store name to Jupiter in 1962. The store would close in 1982. By the time of the photograph on the right, the Newberry sign had been changed to a blue cursive-style logo. Turning back to an image from the 19th century, north of where the Kresge building would be erected in 1928, there were 4 more buildings on the block before the intersection with Pratt Street. By the late 1890s, 3 of these buildings would have the continuous storefront of another early department store, C.S. Hills and Company. Its origins go back to the dry goods store at 359 Main Street, established in the 1820s by Reuben Langdon. A native of Farmington, Connecticut, Langdon came to Hartford in 1817. He was also one of the founders of Society for Savings. Because the society still did not have a permanent home when he became its treasurer in 1829, its operations were moved into the counting room of his dry goods store. Eventually, Society for Savings would find a permanent home on nearby Pratt Street. With the society consuming all of Reuben Langdon's time, the operations of the store passed to his son Joseph Langdon in 1832. For the next 54 years, the firm of Joseph Langdon and Company continued to operate at the same location. In 1886, Joseph Langdon sold out to his then partners Charles W. Cook and Charles S. Hills, who renamed the business Cook and Hills. They would expand their operations from 359 Main Street north to 365 Main. This included the building at the corner of Main and Pratt Streets. The upper floors of the old building on this corner was where the Hartford Current newspaper had its publication office from 1815 to 1867. In that latter year, the building was significantly remodeled by architect O. H. Easton for yet another dry goods merchant named Benjamin Bliss. Bliss had owned the building since 1855 when he opened Bliss & Company on the first floor. The remodeled building featured an enlarged store space with a new front and show window on the Pratt Street side. There was also a new 30 by 60-foot public hall on the top floor. Later, this hall would be occupied for 40 years by the Independent Order of the Free Sons of Israel, Judith Lodge No. 33, which was organized in 1871. Bliss retired due to ill health in 1882, and his son, Edward Langdon Bliss, continued the company until he sold the store and all his stock in 1891 to Cook and Hills. This circa 1895 photograph shows the connected structures that by then made up Cook and Hills. Right around the corner, on Pratt Street, was the 1893 Society for Savings building that still exists today, although it is very much altered. Cook and Hills would have another name change in 1896 when C.S. Hills bought out his partner, C.W. Cook. Hills joined with a new partner, Edwin V. Vedder, not to be confused with Eddie Vedder, to form C.S. Hills and Company. The store continued to occupy the same series of connected buildings, but would streamline the signage along its storefronts. The store would continue for the next 23 years. Some interesting photographs survive of the store's patriotic window displays from the time of World War I. Just after the war, in 1919, Hills and Vedder retired, and the latter's son, E.V. Vedder Jr., formed a new partnership with Albert Steiger, the head of Steiger's department stores, which had its flagship in Springfield, Massachusetts. The new store, called Steiger Vedder, was run by E.V. Vedder Jr. and Albert's son Philip Steiger. The old Hills buildings were replaced by a new Steiger-Vedder building designed by architects Buckman and Kahn of New York. The building was erected and opened in stages between 1919 and 1921. Vedder left the company in 1922, and the Hartford property continued as an Albert Steiger's department store until the company closed it in 1962. The reason for the closure was the difficulty the company had in modernizing a large store that still had 3 separate property owners. As I mentioned, the old Cook and Hills store had come to occupy 3 buildings, all separately owned. This included the Bliss family ownership of the corner of Main and Pratt that dated back to 1855. Ownership by the Talcott family of the structure on the south called the Talcott Building continued with their ownership of the south portion of the Steigers Building. In 1939, the Talcott owners leased the first 2 floors of that section of the building to Lerner Shops, a chain of women's apparel stores. Lerner Shops created a brand new modernistic Main Street facade for the south section of the Steiger Building, which is shown here in this photograph from the 1940s. In 1963, the entire Steiger Building was acquired by Society for Savings, and, as shown in this view westward down Pratt Street from 1980, the building continued to house various commercial tenants for a number of years. Sadly, the building was soon after torn down. As I said at the beginning of this video, the block between Main and Pratt that once housed the pioneering Sawyer and Hills department stores, and also the significant chain stores of Newberry, Kresge, and Steiger, has remained a parking lot since the 1990s. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button. Also, you can help this channel grow by subscribing. Thank you for watching.